They called her Cave Nora, and they said it like the words tasted good in their mouths. Her real name was Lenora Calloway, but in the little town of Silver Bend, Colorado, nobody bothered with real names when a nickname could stick better. That summer of 1886, Nora did not talk much. She hauled stone, she scraped clay, she dragged beams across rocky ground until her shoulders screamed. She hammered until her hands looked like old leather left too long in the sun. The townspeople watched her from a distance, the way you might watch something you did not quite understand. Amusing at first, then unsettling, then simply strange. She had found a wide cave in the bluff a mile outside town. It faced away from the worst wind, angled southeast where the morning sun could warm the entrance. The ceiling rose 14 feet high, plenty of room for smoke to climb and escape through natural cracks in the rock. The cave ran 40 feet deep into the mountain, narrowing toward the back where the earth held its secrets close. Most folks had ridden past that cave for years and never thought about it twice. Nora thought about it every day. She thought about it when she woke before dawn and her muscles ached from the day before. She thought about it when she fell asleep with blisters weeping on her palms. She thought about it when her son looked at her with confusion and her daughter looked at her with trust she was not sure she had earned. The cave was not just shelter to her, it was the last promise she had made to a dying man. She rode into town with her wagon one Tuesday morning, bought nails and rope in a single cast iron stove that cost more than she could afford. She rode back out before anyone could corner her with questions or concerns or the kind of sympathy that felt more like pity. When she needed help lifting a heavy beam, she hired 2 ranch hands for half a day. They were men who had worked with her husband in the silver mines, and they recognized the drawings she carried. They said nothing about it. They lifted the beam, took their pay, and left without questions. She did not ask anyone to stay. She did not ask anyone to believe her. At the saloon that evening, the men gathered as they always did, whiskey and tobacco, and the comfortable weight of opinions shared among friends. Silas Brennan set down his glass and shook his head. He was 45 years old, owned the biggest cattle ranch in the valley, and considered himself an authority on most things. He had lived in Silver Bend for 23 years, which in his mind meant he understood this land better than anyone. "Look at her," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the window and the road beyond. "Building a house in a hole. Woman's lost her mind." Roscoe Pemberton nodded. He ran the general store and prided himself on practical thinking. Grief does strange things to people. Her husbands have been dead 2 years now. Maybe it's finally catching up with her. "She thinks she's smarter than Winter," Silas continued. "Thinks she knows something the rest of us don't." A young man at the end of the bar slapped his hand down with enthusiasm. Colt Dawkins was 19 years old, the son of the saloon owner, a boy who had never known real hardship. He had more confidence than sense and more money than either. "I'll bet $5 she gives up before October," he announced. 10 says the whole thing collapses by Christmas." Laughter rippled through the room. Men reached for their wallets. "I'll take that bet," someone called. "Me too." Colt grinned, collecting the money. He was certain he would be richer by Winter, certain that the crazy widow would fail and everyone would shake their heads and say they had known all along. He would remember this moment later. When he was huddled in that cave, warming his frozen hands by the fire, watching Nora Calloway save his life without asking for a single word of thanks. But that was still months away. For now, the laughter rolled around the room like loose coins in a jar. Old Agnes Thorne sat in the corner with her coffee. She was 68 years old and had lived in Silver Bend longer than anyone. She did not laugh, she did not smile. She just watched through the window as Nora's wagon had passed earlier that day, loaded with supplies and determination. "Let her be," Agnes said quietly. "She's not hurting anyone." Silas raised his glass. "She's hurting my eyes, seeing all that work for nothing." The laughter continued, but Agnes did not join in. She remembered things the others had forgotten. She remembered the winter of 1856, when the cold came down from the mountains like a living thing and took everything it touched. She remembered what it meant to be unprepared. That evening, Opal Brennan held court in her parlor. Silas's wife was 40 years old, sharp-tongued, calm, and considered herself the social center of Silver Bend. 5 women from town sat with teacups balanced on their knees, listening to her assessment. Poor thing has lost her mind from grief, Opal said, shaking her head with practiced sympathy. Building a house in a cave. Can you imagine? Those children will catch their death in that damp hole. The women murmured agreement. Someone should say something to her, one offered. What can you say to a woman who won't listen? Opal replied. We just have to pray she comes to her senses before winter. The gossip spread from that parlor like ripples in a pond. By the end of the week, everyone in Silver Bend had heard some version of the story. The crazy widow, the cave house, the children who would surely freeze. Nora heard the whispers when she came to town for supplies. She heard the laughter that stopped too quickly when she walked past. She saw the sidelong glances and the shaking heads. She kept building anyway. Every morning she took 2 axes to the tree line, one sharp, one dull. She used the sharp one until the blade bit too deep and made her arms shake from the impact. Then she switched to the dull one for smaller branches, for the detailed work that required patience more than power. She stacked the wood under an overhang she had built right inside the cave mouth. She stacked it in neat rows like books on a shelf, and she counted every piece. She counted because numbers did not lie. Numbers did not laugh at you. Numbers did not whisper behind your back. 217 logs by the end of June, 342 by the end of July, 412 by the time the leaves began to turn. The cave was taking shape, a door frame of Douglas fir, each post 12 inches in diameter. A thick plank door made of oak, 4 inches solid, with iron hinges she had ordered from Denver. The door would open inward because she knew snow would pile against it, and she would need to push it through from inside. She lined the interior walls with timber, then packed the gaps with a mixture of clay and straw and dried dung. The mixture would dry hard as stone and trap thousands of tiny air pockets. Still air was the best insulation God ever made. Her father-in-law had taught her that back in Cornwall, where the tin miners knew how to survive underground. She made 2 rooms inside with rough partitions, one for sleeping in the deepest part of the cave where the earth held a constant temperature, one for living closer to the entrance where the stove would warm the air, and she left the middle space open, wide open, room for 50 people to stand, maybe more if they pressed together. She did not tell anyone about that part of the plan. Some things were easier to explain after the fact. Her son, Tobias, watched her work with a mixture of confusion and resentment that only a 12-year-old boy could manage. He was tall for his age, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. He helped when she asked, but she could feel his resistance in every silent moment. One afternoon, he came home from town with a split lip and scraped knuckles. He had been fighting, and Nora did not need to ask why. The Brennan boys, he said, not meeting her eyes. They called you crazy. They said you were building a grave for us. Nora set down the tool she was holding. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw the shame burning behind the anger. What did you say back to them? I hit them. Did it change their minds? Tobias was silent. It never does, Nora said gently. Words are wind, Toby. Let them blow past. What matters is what we build, what we do, not what they say. But why? The question burst out of him like something that had been trapped too long. Why can't we just be normal? Why can't we live in a regular house like everyone else? Why do you have to be so different? Nora felt the weight of the question settle on her shoulders. She could have given him a simple answer. She could have told him to trust her. Instead, she walked to where her saddlebag hung on a nail and pulled out the family Bible. The leather binding was worn soft from years of handling. She opened it to the back cover, where a piece of paper was pressed flat against the end paper. Your father drew this, she said. Tobias looked at the paper, a diagram. Measurements, notes in his father's cramped handwriting. He drew it 2 months before he died, when he could barely breathe, when getting out of bed exhausted him. He used the last of his strength to make sure I knew exactly what to do. Her voice caught, but she pushed through. This cave, this plan, it's not my idea, it's his. His last gift to us. His way of making sure we survive what's coming. What's coming? Nora looked toward the entrance of the camp, toward the valley below where the town sat peaceful and unprepared. Winter, she said, a real one. The kind people forget about until it's too late. Tobias looked at the paper again, at his father's handwriting. at the careful calculations that meant nothing to him but clearly meant everything to his mother. "How do you know?" he asked. "How do you know winter will be bad this year?" Nora did not answer right away. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it back into the Bible. "I don't know for certain," she admitted, "but your father's family survived the winter of 1855 in Cornwall by living in a cave. His grandfather survived, his father survived, and they taught him what they knew." She put her hand on her son's shoulder. "I'd rather build something we don't need than need something we didn't build. Can you understand that?" Tobias nodded slowly. He did not fully understand, not yet. But something in his mother's voice, something in the weight of his father's handwriting, made him pick up a shovel and start digging without another complaint. His sister Lily was different. She was 8 years old with copper hair like her mother and a quiet faith that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her years. She did not ask why. She simply helped. She counted logs when her mother asked her to count. She carried small stones in her apron until her arms ached. She talked to the dog while the work went on, narrating everything as if Copper could understand. "Mother's making the wall smooth today," she would say, scratching behind the collie's ears. "She says smooth walls keep the heat inside. The heat wants to run away, but the smooth walls won't let it." Copper would thump his tail against the ground, his fur the color of burnished copper, his eyes bright with the simple joy of being included. Everett Calloway had given the West to the family 4 years earlier, 2 months before the mine accident that would eventually take his life. Nora looked at the dog sometimes and saw her husband looking back at her. The town continued to watch, and the town continued to talk. Dr. Phineas Aldrich rode up to the worksite one morning in early August. He was 55 years old, thin as a fence post, with spectacles that made his eyes look too large for his face. He had a medical degree from Philadelphia that he mentioned in nearly every conversation. He dismounted his horse and studied the cave entrance with the expression of a man examining a wound. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, not unkindly, "may I speak with you?" Nora wiped sweat from her forehead. "You're speaking now. I've heard about your project. I felt it was my medical duty to express some concerns." She waited, her face neutral. "Caves are damp environments," he continued. "The air can be stagnant. There are legitimate concerns about respiratory health, particularly for children. Your late husband, as I understand it, suffered from lung ailments toward the end. I would be failing in my duty if I did not point out that you may be creating conditions that could harm your children." Nora listened to every word. She could see that he believed what he was saying. This was not mockery. This was genuine concern, filtered through a medical education that knew nothing of cave dwelling. "My husband died because his lungs were destroyed by mine dust and cold air," she said quietly. "He spent 4 days trapped underground after a collapse in 1882. The rescue took too long. By the time they reached him, the damage was done." Dr. Aldrich shifted uncomfortably. "This cave will have ventilation through natural cracks in the rock," Nora continued. "It will have dry heat from a stove. It will have air circulation that I've tested myself. The temperature below the frost line stays constant at 54 degrees, summer and winter. No dampness, no stagnation." She met his eyes directly. "My children will be healthier in this cave than in any wooden cabin when the real cold comes." "The real cold?" "The kind that kills." Dr. Aldrich opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked at the cave, at the careful construction, at the sacks of firewood that grew larger every week. "Mrs. Calloway," he said finally, "I hope you're wrong about this winter." "So do I," she replied, "but I'm not willing to bet my children's lives on hope." He rode away without another word. That night, Nora sat by the fire outside the cave and opened the family Bible again. Her children were asleep inside, their breathing soft in the darkness. Copper lay at her feet, his eyes half closed. She traced her finger over Everett's handwriting. Earth temperature stable at 54 degrees below frost line. Air gap insulation principle. Southeast exposure for morning sun. Protection from northwest wind. Calculate for 50 bodies minimum. 50 bodies, he had known. Even then, dying by inches, he had known that when winter came, it would not just be their family who needed saving. "Don't let them freeze," he had whispered, his hand in hers, his breath rattling. "Promise me, Nora. Don't trust wooden walls. Don't trust what everyone else believes. Trust what the earth teaches. Trust what my father taught me. She had promised. Now she was keeping that promise one log at a time, one stone at a time, one day at a time. The fire crackled. Somewhere down in the valley, faint music drifted up from the saloon. Laughter, the clink of glasses. They did not know what was coming, but she did. What do you think so far? Do you believe Nora is right to trust her husband's knowledge? Or do you think the townspeople have a point? Take a moment to consider. The answer may surprise you. September arrived with a chill that it came earlier than usual. The aspen trees turned gold 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The elk moved down from the high country sooner than anyone expected. Squirrels gathered nuts with a frenzy that seemed almost desperate. Old Agnes Thorne noticed. She had lived in Silver Bend since 1852, back when it was nothing but a cluster of tents around a silver strike. She had buried 2 husbands here, raised 4 children, watched the town grow from desperation to prosperity. She had also survived the winter of 1856. That was not something she talked about often. The memories were too sharp even after 30 years. The cold that crept under every door, the ice that formed on the inside of windows, the sound of her second husband coughing through the night, and then the terrible silence when the coughing stopped. 37 people had died that winter. She had nearly made 38. When Agnes looked at Nora Calloway working on that cave, she did not see a crazy woman. She saw someone who remembered what everyone else had chosen to forget. One afternoon in late September, Agnes hitched her old mare to the buggy and drove up to the bluff. Nora was fitting stones around the cave entrance, creating a windbreak that would shield the door from direct gusts. "Mrs. Calloway," Agnes called out. Nora turned, mortar on her hands, clay streaked up to her elbows. "Mrs. Thorne." Agnes climbed down from the buggy, her joints complaining with every movement. She walked to the cave entrance and studied the work in silence for a long moment. "My second husband died in the winter of 1856, she said finally. "We had a cabin made of good timber, strong walls, tight roof. It wasn't enough." Nora set down her trowel and gave the old woman her full attention. "The cold that year was different," Agnes continued. "It didn't just freeze the water in the buckets. It froze the will to live right out of people, made them give up, made them stop fighting." She paused, her eyes distant. "6 of us survived by hiding in an abandoned mine shaft for 11 days. It was cold down there, but it was steady cold. The earth kept us alive when everything above ground was dying." She turned to face Nora directly. Despite her age, her eyes were sharp. "You know something the rest of them have forgotten." Nora nodded slowly. "My husband knew. His family in Cornwall survived the same way. The principle is the same anywhere in the world. Below the frost line, the earth stays warm enough to live." Agnes reached out and touched the clay-covered wall. Her fingers lingered there, feeling the smoothness, the solidity. "They're laughing at you down in town," she said. "I know. They'll keep laughing until the wind comes." "I know that too." Agnes smiled. It was thin, humorless, but held something that looked like respect. "When it comes," she said, "you let me know if you need help. I'm too old to haul logs, but I can cook. I can tend to the sick. I can keep children calm when the adults are scared." Nora felt something loosen in her chest, something she had not realized was wound so tight. "Thank you," she said. Agnes nodded and walked back to her buggy. Before she climbed up, she turned one more time. "That husband of yours, he must have loved you very much." Nora's throat tightened. "He did." "Then make sure his love wasn't wasted." The buggy rolled away down the slope, and Nora stood watching until it disappeared. She picked up her trowel and went back to work. Sheriff Wyatt Dunn made it his business to know what was happening in his territory. He had worn the badge for 12 years, long enough to develop instincts that warned him when something was wrong. Something about this autumn felt wrong. He could not explain it. The sky looked normal enough. The temperature was cold but not unusual. But there was a pressure in his bones, an unease that reminded him of the feeling before a thunderstorm. This feeling did not pass. It settled in and stayed. He rode up to the Calloway claim on a Tuesday evening in late September. The sun was setting, painting the bluff in shades of orange and red. Nora was outside the cave cooking supper over an open fire. Her two children sat nearby, the boy whittling, the girl reading from a primer. "Mrs. Calloway," Dunn said, dismounting. "Sheriff, mind if I take a look inside?" She gestured toward the cave entrance. "Help yourself." He walked through the doorway, and the change hit him immediately. The air was different, warmer, steadier. Outside, the evening chill was already setting in. Inside the cave, it felt like a comfortable spring afternoon. He ran his hand along the clay-covered walls. Solid, smooth, no gaps, no cracks, no places where wind could find a way through. The stove sat in the center of the main room, a beautiful piece of cast iron with a pipe running up through a crack in the rock ceiling. Along one wall, firewood was stacked in rows that seemed to go on forever. He tried to count the logs and gave up after 200. Barrels lined another wall, water probably, and tins of food, enough to last weeks, maybe months. He walked into the back room, smaller, deeper in the rock. Beds for the family, blankets piled thick. He walked back outside. Nora was stirring something in a pot. It smelled like rabbit stew. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked. "Since May." 5 months, she nodded. He stood there wrestling with something he did not quite understand. He wanted to ask her why. He wanted to ask her what she knew that the rest of them did not. "Mrs. Calloway," he said finally, "I've been watching the sky these past few weeks. I've been watching the animals. Something doesn't feel right. She a certain color before a killing winter, a certain color before a killing winter. Yellow around the edges at sunset, like the light itself is sick." Dunn thought about the sunsets he had seen lately, the strange yellow tinge that did not quite look natural. "I've noticed it," he admitted. "Then you know." "I don't know anything for certain." She turned back to her cooking. "Neither do I. But I'm not willing to gamble with my children's lives." He wanted to warn the town. He wanted to ride to the saloon and tell everyone to start preparing. But he could already hear Silas Brennan's laughter, could already see Dr. Aldrich's skeptical frown. They would not listen. They never did. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "if things get bad this winter, really bad, what will you do?" She did not look up. Her voice was steady as the stone walls around them. "I'll do what needs to be done." He mounted his horse. Before he rode away, he said one more thing. "If it comes to that, you won't be alone. I'll help however I can." She nodded once. He rode away with the feeling that he had just made a promise more important than any he had made in his 12 years wearing the badge. 5 months of being laughed at, talked. 5 months of being laughed at, talked about, avoided in town. It was done. The entrance was framed in heavy timber, reinforced against snow load. The door was thick oak with iron hinges and a bar that could be dropped from inside. The walls were lined with wood and clay, smooth and solid. Inside, everything was ready. 412 logs stacked in neat rows, 6 months of preserved food in sealed tins, two 50-gallon barrels of water with more snow to melt when needed. The stove was installed and tested, drawing perfectly through the natural chimney in the rock. And space, empty space in the middle of the main room, enough for 50 people to stand, maybe more. That evening, she walked through town for the first time in weeks. She needed a few final supplies. Thread for mending, more salt, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds. At the saloon, she passed Silas Brennan and his crowd on the wooden sidewalk. They were standing with drinks in hand, voices loud with confidence. "Hey, Cave Nora," someone called. "Winter's coming. You gonna hibernate like a bear?" Laughter. "Maybe she'll invite the bears in. Keep her warm at night." More laughter. Colt Dawkins raised his glass. "Don't forget our bet, boys. I've got $20 that says she's begging for help by January." Nora climbed onto her wagon without a word. She released the brake and clicked her tongue, and the horse started forward. Behind her, the laughter continued. She did not look back. The cave was finished. 5 months of work, and now it stood ready for whatever winter would bring. But would winter bring the kind of cold Nora feared? Or would she be proven a fool, just as everyone predicted? What do you think? Has all her work been worth it? Or will this winter be mild and the townspeople right to laugh? Hold that thought, because what happens next will change everything. November arrived cold, but not deadly. The first snow fell on the 3rd, a light dusting that melted by noon. People went about their business as usual. Cattle ranchers brought their herds closer to shelter. The general store stocked up on winter supplies. Children attended school and threw snowballs during recess. Everything seemed normal. But Nora watched the sky. The yellow tinge at sunset grew stronger each day. The elk that usually grazed in the high meadows had vanished, moved to lower ground weeks earlier than normal. The old-timers in town noticed, but they kept their concerns to themselves. Speaking about bad omens had a way of making them come true. On the 15th of November, the temperature dropped suddenly, 15 degrees below zero overnight. Water buckets froze solid. Frost formed on the inside of windows. Not unusual for Colorado. Cold snaps happened. People dealt with them and moved on. But this cold had a quality to it that made Nora's bones ache in a way she recognized. An emptiness to the air. A silence that felt like the world holding its breath. At the Brennan Ranch, 3 cattle froze to death that night. They were found in the morning, standing upright in the pasture, ice crystals in their open eyes. Silas buried them without comment. It was just bad luck, he told himself. Nothing more. In town, Dr. Aldrich's office saw a sudden increase in patients. Coughing, frostbitten fingers. The general complaints that came with cold weather. He prescribed rest and warm fluids and tried not to think about Mrs. Calloway's cave. In her cave, Nora kept the stove burning low and steady. The temperature inside held at 58 degrees. Her children did their lessons at the small table she had built. Copper dozed by the fire. Everything was ready. She was ready. Now she could only wait. December began with unusual warmth. The temperature climbed back above freezing. Snow that had accumulated melted away. People in town breathed easier and laughed about the November cold snap. "See," Silas Brennan said at the saloon, "just a bad week. Winter's going to be mild this year. I can feel it in my bones." Roscoe Pemberton agreed. So did most of the other men. The betting pool on Cave Nora's failure grew larger. Reverend Josiah Crane gave a sermon that Sunday about faith and providence. "The Lord protects those who trust in him," he said from the pulpit. "We need not fear the winter when we have faith." The congregation murmured approval. Agnes Thorne sat in the back pew and said nothing, but she watched the sky through the window, and she remembered 1856, the warmth before the killing cold, the false hope that made the end so much worse. She was not fooled. At noon, the barometric pressure began to drop. The sky that morning was wrong. Christmas Eve, 1886. The sun rose through clouds that looked like bruises, purple and yellow and gray, mixed together in a way that made no natural sense. At noon, the barometric pressure began to drop. By 3 o'clock, the first wind arrived from the northwest. Not a breeze, not a gust, a wall of cold that hit Silver Bend like a fist. The temperature fell 30 degrees in 2 hours. By sundown, it was 20 below zero. By midnight, it was 40 below. And still falling. At the Calloway Cave, Nora barred the door and checked the stove. The fire burned steady, fed by logs that had been drying for months. The temperature inside held at 62 degrees. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing. She gathered her children close. Tobias on one side, Lily on the other, Copper at their feet. "It's starting," she said quietly. Tobias looked at her. No confusion in his eyes now. Over the past months, he had come to understand. He had helped stack the firewood. He had helped seal the walls. He had read his father's notes until he knew them by heart. "What do we do?" he asked. Nora pulled both children closer. "We survive," she said, "and when they come, we let them in." "Who?" She did not answer, but she looked toward the door, toward the howling darkness beyond, and she waited. Christmas Day, 1886, 6 o'clock in the morning. The storm had not stopped. It had grown stronger through the night, the wind tearing at every loose board in Silver Bend, the snow falling not downward but sideways, driven horizontal by gusts that peaked at 65 miles per hour. At the Brennan Ranch, Silas woke to the sound of his youngest son coughing. Tommy was 5 years old, a sturdy boy who had never been seriously ill. But the sound coming from his chest that morning is wrong. Wet and ragged and deep, like something was broken inside him. Opal was already at the boy's bedside, her face pale with fear. "The fire went out," she said, "sometime in the night. The chimney, Something's wrong with the chimney. Silas threw on his coat and fought his way outside. The front door would barely open against the snow piled 3 feet deep. He shouldered through, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. The chimney was caked with ice, frozen solid. No smoke could pass through, which meant no fire could burn without filling the house with poison. He grabbed a shovel and attacked the ice, but it was inches thick, and the wind kept knocking him backward. His hands went numb in minutes. He could feel the cold creeping into his chest with every breath. Back inside, smoke hung in the air from their last attempt to restart the fire. The children were coughing. Opal was coughing. Tommy lay on the bed, his breathing shallow, his lips turning blue. "We have to get out," Silas said. "And go where?" Opal's voice cracked. "It's 50 below out there with the wind. We won't make it 100 yards. Silas stood in the middle of his home, the home he had built with his own hands, the home that had sheltered his family for 15 years. Smoke swirled around him. His children whimpered. His wife clutched the baby to her chest, eyes wide with terror, and he had no answer. At 7 o'clock, Sheriff Wyatt Dunn fought his way to the Brennan Ranch. It took him 40 minutes to travel a distance he usually covered in 10. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the wind stopped him in his tracks every few seconds. Twice he fell, twice he forced himself back up. He found Silas outside, still trying to clear the chimney with bare hands. The man's fingers were white with frostbite, past the point of pain. "Silas!" Dunn shouted over the wind. "Get inside! The chimney, I have to... You're going to die out here." He dragged Silas back through the door. Inside, the smoke had thinned, but so had the warmth. The cabin was cold. Not as cold as outside, but cold enough. Cold enough to kill. Tommy lay on the bed, wrapped in every blanket they owned. His breathing had become shallow. His lips had turned completely blue. "We have to move him," Dunn said. Silas stared at him, his frozen hands trembling. "Move him where? The boarding house? The church?" "Neither will hold in this cold. The boarding house has gaps in the walls. The church has that big window on the north side. It'll shatter before nightfall." "Then where?" Dunn looked at Silas, saw the desperation in the man's eyes, saw the pride mating against the fear, the stubborn certainty that he had been right about everything crumbling in the face of his dying son. "You know where," Dunn said quietly. Silas's face went rigid. "No." "Silas, I won't go begging to that woman, not after everything I said." "Your son is dying." The words hung in the frozen air. Silas looked at Tommy, at the shallow rise and fall of the boy's chest, at the blue spreading from his lips to his cheeks. His son was dying, and pride was not going to save him. 1 mile. In good weather, it took 15 minutes, 1 mile. In good weather, it took 15 minutes. That Christmas morning, it took an hour and a half. The wind did not let up. The snow did not stop. The cold found every gap in their wrapping and drove needles of ice into their skin. Halfway there, Silas fell. His legs simply gave out. Dunn hauled him up. "Keep moving. Move or die." They kept moving. Opal carried the baby inside of her coat, pressed against her body. The older children walked between the adults, stumbling with every step. Tommy was on Silas's back, unconscious now, his small body a weight that grew heavier with every step. Dunn led the way because he had been to the cave before. He knew the landmarks. He could barely see them through the snow, but he knew they were there. Finally, impossibly, they reached the bluff. The cave entrance appeared through the white chaos, the heavy timber frame dark against the snow. Dunn pounded on the door. Nothing. He pounded again. Still nothing. Then from inside, a voice. "Who is it?" "Dunn, I've got the Brennan family. The boy's not breathing right." A moment of silence that seemed to stretch forever. Then the sound of the bar lifting. The door swung open. Nora Calloway stood in the opening, lamplight spilling out around her like a halo. Her face was calm, unsurprised. She looked at the snow-covered figures huddled before her, at the limp child on Silas's back, at the terror in their eyes, and she stepped aside. "Get in," she said, "all of you." Heat. That was the first thing Silas felt when he stumbled through the door. Heat like a physical presence wrapping around him, soaking into his frozen bones. The cave was warm, not just bearable. Warm. 60 degrees at least, maybe more. Steam rose from his snow-covered coat. Water dripped from his beard. His hands, which had felt like blocks of wood, began to tingle and burn as sensation returned. Nora was already moving. She took Tommy from Silas's arms before he fully realized she was there. "Lay him here," she said, pointing to a spot near the stove, but not too close. Slow warming, too fast, and the shock could kill him. She wrapped the boy in dry blankets. She put a warm cloth on his forehead. She tilted his head back slightly to open his airway. Opal sank onto a bench, the baby still clutched to her chest. Tears were streaming down her face, freezing in tracks on her cheeks before melting in the warmth. The other children stood in a cluster, too cold and scared to speak. Nora looked at them, then at her own daughter. "Lily," she said, "hot water with honey, 1 cup for each of them." Lily moved immediately. She had been preparing for this moment too. The whole family had been preparing. Tobias appeared with dry blankets. He handed one to each of the Brennan children without a word, without judgment, without any trace of satisfaction at seeing the people who had mocked his mother now begging for her help. Copper sniffed at the newcomers, then settled back by the fire, his tail thumping softly against the ground. Nora worked on Tommy for several minutes, checking his breathing, listening to his chest, massaging his hands and feet to restore circulation. Finally, the boy coughed. Once. Twice. A wet, rattling sound that somehow seemed better than the silence before. His eyes fluttered open. "Mama?" he whispered. Opal burst into sobs. She rushed to her son, falling to her knees beside him, gathering his small body into her arms. "I'm here," she said. "I'm here, baby. We're safe." Silas stood in the middle of the cave, water pooling at his feet, and stared at the woman who had saved his family, the woman he had called crazy, the woman he had mocked for 6 months. She was not looking at him. She was checking on the other children, making sure no one had frostbite, making sure everyone was warming properly. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. His voice came out as a croak. She turned. "Mr. Brennan." He opened his mouth, closed it again. No words came. What could he possibly say? The storm did not stop. The first day passed in a blur of fear and cold, and the howl of wind that never stopped. The second day brought more refugees, more desperate families stumbling through the snow. By the third day, the cave had become a world unto itself, cut off from everything outside. Sheriff Dunn went out again and again, searching for survivors, bringing them back in groups of 2 and 3 and 10. Each trip took longer. Each trip took more out of him. The boarding house had lost its roof. The church windows had shattered, just as Dunn had predicted. Half the cabins in town had chimneys frozen solid, fires that would not burn, walls that let the cold seep through. By the third night, 72 people were sheltered in Nora Calloway's cave. She kept count. She always kept count. The cave was crowded now, bodies pressed close together, but the warmth held. 58 degrees near the walls, 64 near the stove. Warm enough to survive, warm enough to hope. Nora organized everything with the precision of a general commanding troops. Sick people near the stove, where the air was warmest and the steam from the kettle could ease their breathing. Children in the back room, the deepest and most protected part of the cave. Strong men near the door, ready to clear snow or help new arrivals. She rationed the firewood, 2 logs per hour, no more. They had enough to last weeks if they were careful. If they were wasteful, they would freeze before the storm ended. She rationed the food, flour and beans and dried meat, stretched into thin soup that filled bellies without emptying stores too quickly. She rationed the water, melting snow in batches, making sure everyone drank but no one drank too much. And she kept the peace. That was the hardest part. 72 people in a space meant for 10. Fear and exhaustion and the constant howl of wind, tempers frayed, arguments erupted. Nora appeared beside him so quickly he did not see her. Nora appeared beside him so quickly he did not see her coming. "The warmest spots go to those who need them most," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Children, the elderly, the sick. If you're strong enough to shove, you're strong enough to stand near the wall." Colt's face reddened. He opened his mouth to argue, then looked around at the faces watching him. At the old man he had pushed. At Nora, who showed no anger, only certainty. He walked to the wall without another word. He returned at noon with 12 more. He returned at noon with 12 more people, including Dr. Phineas Aldrich. The doctor looked like a ghost. His face was gray, his lips cracked, his hands wrapped in bloody bandages where frostbite had already begun its work. The window, he said, his voice barely audible. The front window of my office. It exploded from the cold. Glass everywhere. I couldn't stop the bleeding and keep warm at the same time. Nora guided him to a spot near the fire. She examined his hands with the same calm efficiency she had shown with everyone else. "You'll keep the fingers," she said, "but they'll scar." He looked at her. Recognition flickered in his eyes. The woman he had warned about cave living. The woman whose judgment he had questioned. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I was wrong about everything. Drink this." She handed him a cup of warm broth. "We'll talk about that later." He drank without another word. On the fifth day, Reverend Josiah Crane arrived. He came alone. His wife and 2 children had reached the cave the day before, brought by Sheriff Dunn. But the Reverend had refused to come with them. He had stayed in the church, insisting that his faith would protect him, that God would provide. God had not provided. The church roof collapsed on the 4th night, unable to bear the weight of accumulated snow. Crane had barely escaped, crawling out through a broken window as the timbers fell around him. He had spent 12 hours wandering in the blizzard before finding his way to the bluff. When Dunn dragged him through the door, the Reverend could not walk. His feet were frozen solid. He had to be carried to a spot near the fire. Dr. Aldrich examined him, his own bandaged hands clumsy but functional. "The left foot might be saved," Aldrich said quietly, so only Nora could hear. "The right, he'll lose toes, maybe more." Crane was conscious. He heard every word. His eyes found Nora across the crowded cave. She looked back without expression. This was the man who had preached against her, who had implied that living in a cave was unchristian, who had suggested that her preparations were a rejection of God's providence. Now he lay on her floor, his feet destroyed by the cold his faith was supposed to prevent. She walked to where he lay, knelt beside him. "Your family is safe," she said. "Your wife, your children, they're in the back room." His eyes filled with tears. "I said things, from the pulpit, about you. I know. I was a fool." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood. "Yes," she said, "you were. But you're here now, and that's what matters." She walked away to tend to others. Crane lay staring at the ceiling, tears running down his cheeks, and began to pray for the first time in his life with true humility. A week passed. The storm showed no sign of ending. People stopped counting days and started counting heartbeats, counting the logs in the woodpile, counting the hours until their next bowl of thin soup. Nora counted 84 people. The cave was beyond capacity now. Bodies covered every inch of floor space. People slept sitting up because there was no room to lie down. Children slept in their parents' laps. Strangers pressed against strangers, sharing warmth because there was no other choice. On the 8th day, Willa Garnett went into labor. She was 22 years old, the wife of a miner who was trapped somewhere on the other side of the valley. 7 months pregnant. The baby was not supposed to come for another 8 weeks, but the baby was coming now. Dr. Aldrich's hands were still bandaged, still clumsy, but he was the only doctor. There was no choice. Nora cleared a space in the back room. She sent the children to the main area. She boiled water. She found clean cloth. The labor lasted 6 hours. 84 people sat in silence while Willa screamed in the back room. Some prayed, some wept, some simply stared at the walls and waited. At 2 o'clock in the morning, a new sound filled the cave. Crying, high and thin and desperate, a baby's first breath. Nora emerged a few minutes later. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands red from work. "It's a girl," she said. "Mother and baby are both alive." The cave seemed to exhale. Relief and joy and something like hope, all mixed together in the warm air. Willa held her daughter close. The baby was small, too small, but she was breathing. She was alive. "What will you name her?" someone asked. Willa looked at Nora, at the woman who had caught her baby, who had made sure she had clean cloths and warm water, who had built this shelter where life could continue even when death ruled outside. "Hope," Willa said. "Her name is Hope." She paused, her eyes still on Nora. Hope Eleanor. Nora turned away, but not before the others saw the tears on her cheeks. What would you have done? If you had been one of the people who mocked her, would you have had the courage to knock on her door? And if you were Nora, would you have opened it? Think about that for a moment, because the hardest part is not surviving the storm. It's living with the people who doubted you after it ends. The storm finally broke on January 4th, 1887, 11 days after it began. That morning, the wind simply stopped. The snow stopped falling, the clouds parted, and sunlight poured down onto a world transformed by white. Sheriff Dunn was the first to open the door. The cold that rushed in was still brutal, 12 below zero. But it was not the killing cold of the past 11 days. It was survivable. He stepped outside and looked at Silver Bend, or what was left of it. Half the roofs had collapsed. The church steeple was gone, snapped off and buried somewhere under the snow. The general store's front wall had caved in. The boarding house was buried to its second-floor windows. In the cemetery at the edge of town, 3 fresh mounds of white marked the places where people had died before anyone could reach them. But only 3. 97 people had survived in the cave. 98, counting baby Hope. Because of one woman who had been laughed at for building a home in a hole. Began the slow, grinding work of rebuilding. But something had changed. You could see it in the way people looked at each other, in the silence that fell whenever Nora Calloway's name was mentioned, in the shame that flickered across faces when they remembered the things they had said. She had saved them, not with words, not with sermons, not with promises, with stone and clay and timber, with firewood stacked in careful rows, with a door thick enough to hold back the killing wind, with work. The town meeting was held 3 weeks later in the hastily repaired saloon. Every adult in Silver Bend was there, even Nora, who had been convinced by Agnes Thorne that her presence was necessary. "They need to see you," Agnes had said. "They need to look you in the eye and say what needs to be said." So Nora came. She stood at the back of the room, her children beside her, Copper at her feet. She did not speak. She waited. Silas Brennan stood first. His hands were still bandaged from the frostbite. His face was thinner than it had been before the storm. Something in his eyes had changed. The easy confidence replaced by something harder and more honest. "I need to say something," he said, "and I need everyone to hear it." The room went silent. 6 months ago, I stood in this very spot and called Lenora Calloway a fool. I said she was building her own grave. I said she thought she was smarter than Winter. He paused. His voice caught. My son almost died in my arms. My family nearly froze to death in a house I built with my own hands. And the only reason any of us are still breathing is because that woman, the woman I mocked, the woman I laughed at, opened her door and let us in." He looked around the room, met every pair of eyes. "I was wrong. We were all wrong. And I don't know how to make that right. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying." He sat down. Silence held for a moment. Then Roscoe Pemberton stood. "I refuse to sell her nails," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "She had to walk 12 miles in the cold to buy supplies from another town. Because I was too proud to help." He swallowed hard. "She saved my wife, my daughter. She saved them when I couldn't, and I will never forgive myself for what I said about her." One by one, others rose to speak. Colt Dawkins, the young man who had bet on her failure, admitted that he had been a fool. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Doctor." Aldrich stood with his scarred hands visible to everyone. "I told her that caves were dangerous," he said. "I used my medical degree like a weapon against her. I thought I knew better because I had studied in Philadelphia." He shook his head. "She understood something my textbooks never taught me. She understood that survival is not about knowledge. It's about wisdom. And wisdom comes from listening to those who came before." Then Reverend Josiah Crane rose. He moved slowly, leaning on a crutch. His right foot was heavily bandaged. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The room went completely still. "I told you that Mrs. Calloway was rejecting God's providence," he said. His voice was different now, broken, stripped of its pulpit confidence. "I told you that living in a cave was returning to paganism. I told you that faith alone would protect us from the cold." He paused. His hand moved to his damaged foot. I lost 2 toes to my own pride. I nearly lost my family because I was too stubborn to admit that a woman knew something I did not. He looked at Nora directly. His eyes were wet. There is a verse in the book of James that I forgot. Faith without works is dead. Mrs. Calloway's faith had works. She built, she prepared. She did the hard thing while the rest of us laughed and prayed and did nothing. He bowed his head. I will never preach against practical wisdom again, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the mercy she showed me when she let me into her home. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Nora walked forward. She did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. She looked tired and shaken and determined. I don't need your apologies, she said. Her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. I didn't build that cave to prove anyone wrong. I built it because my husband asked me to. Because he knew what winter could do, and he wanted to make sure our children survived. She paused. But if you want to make this right, here is what I need from you. Not words, not gratitude, not tears. She looked around the room. I need you to learn. I need you to build. I need you to make sure this never happens again. When the next person does something that doesn't make sense to you, don't laugh. Ask why. Listen to the answer. And if they need help, give it. She met Silas's eyes. Can you do that? Silas nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, I can. All of you. The room murmured agreement, voices rough with emotion, heads nodding. Then we're square, Nora said. Oh my God. Now let's get to work. The spring that followed was unlike any Silver Bend had seen. Work crews organized by Silas Brennan dug cellars beneath every home in town. They followed the plans from Everett Calloway's drawings, plans that Nora shared freely with anyone who asked. Stone foundations, depth below the frost line, ventilation through natural gaps in the rock, or through carefully constructed chimneys. By summer, 12 underground shelters had been completed. Each one was stocked with firewood and food. Each one had a stove and a door thick enough to hold back the wind. Dr. Aldrich took charge of documenting everything. His scarred hands moved slowly across the pages of his journal, recording temperatures and measurements and observations. 54 degrees, he announced one afternoon, standing in Nora's cave with a thermometer in his hand. Constant, year-round. Below the frost line, the earth maintains this temperature regardless of conditions above ground. He looked at Nora with something like wonder. Your husband's family understood thermal mass insulation centuries before modern science gave it a name. Everything I learned in Philadelphia told me you were wrong. But you were right, and I was a fool. Nora shrugged. He just wanted to keep his family warm. That's all any of us want. Willa Garnett became Nora's unofficial apprentice. Her baby Hope was thriving, growing stronger every day. Willa wanted to learn everything: how to seal walls, how to stack firewood, how to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. My husband is still at the mine, she said one afternoon. When he comes home, I'm going to teach him everything. We're going to build a cellar, a proper one. We're never going to be caught unprepared again. Nora smiled. It was one of the first genuine smiles she had allowed herself in years. That's all I ever wanted, she said, for people to learn. What do you think would have happened if Nora had kept her door closed? If she had let her anger at all those months of mockery keep her from helping? Sometimes the hardest thing is not building the shelter. It's opening the door to the people who laughed while you built it. The years passed, as years do. Tobias Calloway grew into a strong young man. He learned carpentry from watching his mother, became the best builder in the valley. He specialized in underground structures, root cellars and storm shelters, and the kind of practical construction that saved lives. He married a girl from Denver who had heard the story of the cave widow and wanted to meet the family. They had 3 children, all of whom learned to stack firewood before they learned to read. Lily became a teacher. She traveled to schools throughout Colorado, teaching children about winter survival. She carried her mother's knowledge with her everywhere she went. She never married. She said she was too busy teaching the next generation. Copper the dog lived to be 17 years old, an extraordinary age for a collie. He spent his final years lying by the fire in the cave, his muzzle gray, his eyes still bright with loyalty. When he died, they buried him next to Everett's grave on the hill overlooking the valley. The headstone read, "Faithful to the last winter." Nora wept at his burial, the first tears she had allowed herself since her husband's death, 13 years before. Nora Calloway lived to be 75 years old. She never left the cave. Even when Tobias built her a proper house in town, she refused to move. "This is my home," she said. "This is where your father wanted me to be." She died in her sleep on a spring night in 1923. Lily was with her at the end, holding her hand as her breathing slowed and finally stopped. They buried her next to Everett and Copper, on the hill where the sunrise was beautiful and the wind was always gentle. The funeral was attended by everyone in Silver Bend and by visitors from towns across Colorado, people who had heard the story, people who had survived because someone they knew had learned from Nora's example. Sheriff Wyatt Dunn, now in his late 80s, stood at the grave with tears running down his weathered face. "She was the bravest person I ever knew," he said, "and the most stubborn, and the most right about everything." He laughed through his tears. "God help me, she was always right." In 1927, a team of researchers from the Colorado School of Mines came to Silver Bend. Dr. Phineas Aldrich, now 80 years old but still sharp, led them personally. His hands were scarred and stiff, but his mind remained clear. He had spent the past 40 years documenting the cave's construction, measuring its temperature through every season, recording everything in leather journals that filled an entire shelf in his office. "This is what we came to see," he told the young researchers as they stood inside the cave. "Passive heating, thermal mass insulation, principles that modern architecture is only beginning to understand." He showed them Everett Calloway's original drawings, preserved under glass. This man understood these principles intuitively, from knowledge passed down through generations. His family in Cornwall had been using these techniques for centuries. One of the young researchers studied the measurements with growing amazement. 54 degrees constant, he said, even during the worst winter on record. "That's remarkable." Aldrich nodded. "More than remarkable. It's life-saving." Lily Calloway, now 49 years old with silver in her copper hair, served as their guide through the cave. "My father drew those plans 2 months before he died," she said, "when he could barely breathe. When getting out of bed exhausted him. He used the last of his strength to make sure we knew exactly what to do." She touched the stone wall with the same reverence her mother had shown decades before. "This cave saved 98 people during the blizzard of 1887. It saved my family. It saved this whole town." The researchers wrote everything down. They took photographs. They made measurements. Their report would eventually be published in 3 scientific journals and cited in dozens of papers on sustainable architecture. But for Lily, the most important moment came at the end of the visit. One of the young researchers, a woman not much older than Lily had been during that terrible winter, asked a simple question. "What would you tell people who are preparing for hard times? People who might be laughed at for doing something different?" Lily thought for a moment, then she smiled. "Do it anyway," she said. "Build what needs building. Prepare for what might come. And when they come knocking on your door, cold and scared and sorry for laughing, let them in anyway." She paused. "That's what love does. It opens the door, even when it hurts." The cave still stands today. The walls Nora built with her own hands have not crumbled. The clay she smoothed with her bleeding fingers is still solid. The door frame, replaced twice over the decades, still holds a thick plank that opens inward. The Silver Bend Historical Society maintains the site as a museum. Visitors come from across the country to see where nearly 100 people survived the Great Blizzard of 1887. Inside, mounted on the wall, is a photograph taken in 1888. It shows Nora standing in front of the cave entrance, Tobias and Lily on either side of her, Copper at her feet. She is not smiling in the photograph. Her face is serious, determined. The face of a woman who had looked death in the eye and built something stronger. Beneath the photograph, carved into the stone wall by Everett's own hand before he died, are words that have guided generations. "Survival is not about strength. It is about listening to those who came before." Every October, on the anniversary of the first snowfall, the people of Silver Bend hold a ceremony at the cave. They light candles. They read the names of those who survived the blizzard. They remember the 3 who did not. And they tell the story. The story of a woman who was laughed at for building a home in a hole. The story of a winter that tried to kill them all. The story of a door that opened when it could have stayed closed. The children listen with wide eyes. They imagine the cold. They imagine the fear. They imagine what it must have been like to stumble through that blizzard and see the warm glow leaking around the edges of that thick oak door. Then they go home to houses with cellars dug deep into the earth. Houses prepared for whatever winter might bring. Because Nora Calloway taught them. Because Everett Calloway's plans are still passed from family to family. Because some lessons, once learned, are never forgotten. If this story touched you, take a moment to think about the people in your own life who do the hard things while others laugh, the ones who prepare, the ones who build, the ones who work quietly while the world mocks them. Maybe it's time to stop laughing and start asking why. Maybe it's time to pick up a hammer and help. And remember this, when the storm comes, and it always does, it's not the ones who laugh the loudest who survive. It's the ones who built the strongest.